Hello, and welcome to Grand Rounds for the Minnesota Regional Spinal Cord Injury Model System, or MINSCIMS, as we call it for short. Thank you all for joining us today. MINSCIMS is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDILRR, to support innovative projects and research in the delivery, demonstration, and evaluation of medical, rehabilitation, vocational, and other services to meet the needs of individuals with spinal cord injury, and they also have a model system for brain injury and burn. Next slide, please. Thank you. MINSCIMS represents an exciting partnership among the following Minnesota institutions: Courage Kenny Rehabilitation Institute in Minneapolis, Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Regents Hospital in St. Paul, and the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. Next slide, please. Our community collaborators include the Minnesota Spinal Cord Injury Association, Unite to Fight Paralysis, Get Up, Stand Up to Cure Paralysis, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, United Spinal Association, and the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium. This system collectively provides a multidisciplinary continuum of care for people with spinal cord injury, including emergency medical, acute care, acute rehabilitation, and post-acute services. My name is Dr. Kimberly Mondin, and I will be the moderator for today's session. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Rehab Med at the University of Minnesota Medical School, and I'm the project director of the MINSCIMS. Next slide, please. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. The University of Minnesota has organized the CME for today's webinar. Please see the chat for information on how to record your attendance and claim CME credit for attending this webinar within 24 hours of the event. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the MINSCIMS website. To earn CME credit for today's presentation, please click on the link in the chat. Due to the number of registrants for today's webinar, we've placed phone lines on mute to reduce audio feedback. However, we welcome and encourage audience participation using the Q&A function. If you have technical or logistical questions, we ask that you please submit those in the chat to Dan Kelly. We extend a huge thanks to those who work behind the scenes to make these webinars possible. Next slide, please. The title of today's presentation is User-Centered Optimization of Virtual Reality Training Interfaces to Rehabilitate Motor Function. And our speaker for today's webinar is Dr. Raviraj. Dr. Nataraj is an assistant professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Stevens Institute of Technology. He received his PhD in biomedical engineering at Case Western Reserve University and his master's in mechanical engineering at Stanford University. His postdoc work involved motor restoration and sensory motor assessment of persons having spinal cord injury, amputation, or carpal tunnel syndrome. As an independent investigator, his research focus is motor training with computerized interfaces that rehabilitate upper extremity function after SCI or traumatic brain injury. His lab examines how virtual reality and instrumented wearables used for motor training can leverage changes in perception and physiological responses to maximize functional outcomes. The lab's ongoing work is done in partnership with the Bronx VA Medical Center and the Kessler Foundation, with funding from the Department of Veterans Affairs, the New Jersey Health Foundation, and the NSF Disability and Rehabilitation Engineering Career Award. Dr. Nataraj recently received the Stevens Harvey Davis Distinguished Teaching Award and has served on the grant review panels for NIDILRR, NSF, and NIH. Welcome, and thank you for presenting.
Thank you, Kim.
I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim, for the introduction, and Dan for your assistance, and then Habib with the original invitation. Very happy to have this opportunity to speak to all of you about the work that my lab has been doing for about the last 6 to 7 years since I've been at Stevens as an assistant professor in biomedical engineering, as mentioned. I have no financial conflicts of interest to disclose. So the way that I've broken down this particular talk is I just wanted to speak briefly about my educational background, which Kim had summarized to a certain degree, just to give you a sense as to what my perspective is from the approach that my lab is currently taking. And then I'll talk a little bit more about what our motivations are and specific directives as it relates to computerized interfaces for motor rehabilitative training. I'll talk a little bit about how initially we were really just looking to demonstrate some basic concepts, fundamental science concepts, as a basis by which to then develop these particular platforms that leverage computerized interfaces, mainly virtual reality, with the intention of improving motor function for people with neurological injury, either to the brain or mainly to the spinal cord. So Kim already went through some of the places that I had done my training, but across all of my training experiences, essentially, I developed feedback controllers for powered assistive devices that restore motor function. I'm not sure if the videos are actually playing on my end now, but here, I can click on them manually. So the perspective that I've been trained with is developing approaches that involve activation of muscles or nerve pathways in order to recover various motor function following spinal cord injury or amputation. Typically, we are trying to take model-based approaches where we verify that our feedback controller can work under certain circumstances for either standing function, walking function, or grasping function before then translating it to the laboratory and working with somebody who has some type of dysfunction that's been diagnosed clinically. So moving on. So currently in my lab, instead of working with powered assistive devices, taking the skills that I developed mainly on the modeling end and also implementations in the laboratory as it relates to instrumented wearables to come up with these training interfaces, mainly in virtual reality, where we're trying to guide individuals to practice the best version of a particular movement, whether it be reaching, and we're starting to go into some function in the lower body, but mainly in my lab currently, we've been looking at reaching and grasping function. So as I mentioned, mainly we're working with virtual reality-based platforms. And in the short term, we've been trying to demonstrate these fundamental science concepts to say how somebody is going to respond to how they're being guided using sensory-driven cues within these computerized interfaces. And response includes not only how they're performing in terms of how well they're doing the motor task, but then also any changes in perception, and then also physiological level responses. The goal is to really, in the long term, develop these adaptive platforms that isn't just tracking how well somebody's doing, but how they're feeling as part of the training process, in which to then adapt what we can in terms of difficulty or how we're presenting guidance cues to support, or I should say, accelerate gains in function with training. So as I think a lot of people here know, physical therapy is very time and effort intensive, and virtual reality for the most part has gained its benefits from just gamified constructs to make the process more fun, such that individuals will participate more and essentially receive larger dosages of therapy. But then I'm taking the premise whereby, given the programmability of the environment, there may be ways in which we optimize an individual's experience with that environment such that they're also doing better in terms of increases in motor function per dose of therapy. So the big vision of my lab is essentially what I explained, where we're trying to come up with these interfaces that adapt the programmable features, including difficulty and how we're providing sensory cues. So I'm going to use this term quite often, augmented sensory feedback. So that means in training, we're providing additional cues to performance. So the person can see fundamentally how well they're doing the task. There may be an avatar that they're controlling. Very often what we're doing are these target-based tasks where you have to control an avatar to be able to hit targets efficiently and accurately. And a person can get a sense as to how well they're doing that on their own. But in motor learning literature, it's been demonstrated that if you provide additional cues to really make someone aware when they're deviating from a more optimal path of motion, that can in fact enhance learning of the task. So we're basically trying to leverage that as part of our VR training paradigms and really trying to categorically dimensionalize those augmented sensory feedback signals according to features of like how complex is the feedback, how often we're providing the feedback, and then what type of feedback, meaning is it more visual, is it more haptic, and then we've done some basic audio cueing as well. We haven't looked so much into task difficulty yet, and that's actually part of the current work that we're doing that we're funded from the NSF to examine, trying to identify ways to adapt according to task difficulty and how the person is responding to that level of difficulty. So again, how the person responds is based on these psychophysiological variables describing perceptions and physiological states. And then, of course, most importantly, how are they performing the task? So my larger scale premise is that, if we're consistently paying attention to how the person is feeling, not just how they're doing, that over a period of time with these more longitudinal protocols, where people have follow-up sessions, that we are in a way trying to maximize well-being in addition to function with these kinds of approaches. So when we're talking about personalizing or optimizing the training interface, the goals are to make sure that the user feels very in sync with the interface, and that we're facilitating their ability to learn the motor task better and more quickly. So ultimately, the goal is to advance their level of function and hopefully have them adhere to these types of practices in clinical settings better, i.e. improve clinical retention. So when we're talking about how is the user feeling, what are the variables that we're measuring toward this end? So first, there are variables to indicate user engagement. So there's potentially several variables to look at along these lines. We, based on some background that I've had as a trainee, we're generally interested in sense of agency, which is the degree to which someone is perceiving that they are the ones responsible or in control of their actions. So this question really comes about when you have a powered assistive device where the person may be triggering the device to do something, or they're working in synergy with the device, but they're still receiving assistance from said device. So even from a training perspective where, we're not using any powered assistance in what we're currently doing, if we provide them these visual representations where the task still can be successfully done or done better, despite what their input into the task is, there may be some basis by which you're positively validating them and making them either feel more or less in control. And the goal is to determine to what degree does that lead to better performance for them with repetitive repetitions with this approach. And then again, we're looking at physiological measures, mainly brain EEG. We're starting to also look at autonomic activity with electrodermal activity. We use non-invasive sensors for all of these measurements. Everything is done at the skin surface. Ultimately, we're trying to get some sense as to what physiologically they're demonstrating in terms of their involvement in motor actions. And again, does that ultimately facilitate better performance? And if it does, then the onus is on us in personalizing the interface to have them reach these physiological targets per se, such that they can persistently have good performance. So hopefully, we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but the idea is that, maybe we keep them in states where they don't feel overly exerted, but still engaged enough such that they're maximizing their training repetitions regardless. So what are the approaches that support user learning? Augmented sensory feedback, which I described, that has been demonstrated to be very effective in motor learning. There's quite a bit of literature to this end. What we're doing that I think is a little bit more nuanced is we're really looking at these specific features of complexity and intermittency and type of feedback, and seeing how that may play a role in facilitating motor learning as part of rehabilitation paradigms. And such customizations and training are ultimately very readily done with computerized interfaces, including virtual reality. So we should be well positioned in theory to be able to address this problem. So my lab ultimately has two major project lines. So we're examining variations in control of the interface. So if we make the interface purposefully maybe a little hyper responsive or laggy, or do we automate some of what is being visualized as part of the interface where the device in fact has more of a role in accomplishing the task? How does that ultimately modulate the user's performance and sense of agency? That's a key question of interest for us. And then mainly now, where we're in the place that we're developing platforms for rehabilitation, we're really focusing on features of augmented sensory feedback and seeing how that's impacting performance and psychophysiological measures. So I've mentioned agency a couple of times. How is it measured? I think all of us intuitively are familiar with the notion of agency, but in terms of how we measure it, generally it's done through surveys. You basically ask the individual, on a scale of 0 to 100, or, on a Likert type scale, the degree to which they believe they are responsible for the actions that they're seeing, in this case, as part of a computerized interface. And I was part of a group in 2018 that demonstrated that with the restoration of kinesthetic illusion for amputees using a sensory motor prosthesis, that they, in fact, would reflect greater agency. So there are also surrogate measures for agency other than surveys. That's the most direct way to measure agency, but as some of you probably are familiar with, there are challenges with survey instruments. It's very much a science in how you deliver the surveys to make sure that you're getting the most credible feedback possible. A measure that's a little bit easier to tease out are these time interval estimates that have been demonstrated to have some correlation to agency. I'll spare you from the details of the seminal work, but essentially it was demonstrated that when you have greater agency, you bind in time, in your perception of time, your action to some sensory consequence. So in everyday activities, or for activities of daily living, a simple example might be, your action to reach for an object, and the consequence being actually successfully grasping that object and feeling that object in your hand. That may be how you would describe this more as a sensory consequence. Certainly visually, you're also seeing it as well, where you're seeing the hand approaching the actual object. So when you feel like you have greater agency over that action, you perceive your action to the sensory consequence as being more binded in time. The seminal study, I'll just say, that's been cited like thousands of times over and used in a variety of protocols that have nothing to do necessarily with motor function. Originally used transcranial magnetic stimulation as a basis to prove this, where TMS is what elicited the motor action, which was pressing a button, versus when the person voluntarily did it themselves. And they were able to demonstrate this time effect using that paradigm, and fairly convincingly. There is arguments as to whether or not time perception in and of itself is a good proxy for agency, but that's argumentative. But either way, there's a perception that's out there that is indicative of agency, and that our lab is trying to correlate with performance. So the idea is we'll personalize or redesign these interfaces in which we're monitoring sense of agency, such that we presume that there may be some performance benefits to it. Okay, so this is an example of a couple of the more fundamental science experiments we did early on to show for either motion control setups or force control setups, there could be this correlation between agency and improved performance. So basically, in either setup, we varied the level of control. So in the first case, we are using marker-based motion capture for somebody doing a reach to grasp in space, and then having that motion drive an avatar to essentially do the same thing. So the person is viewing everything in virtual reality. And I'm not going to show all the variations, but basically we have variations of control where initially the hand is supposed to be the virtual hand is coupled to the real hand in space and time. But then we do variations off of that, where we either automate to some degree in which the hand moves on its own once you get it started. We add some noise. We can change the sensitivity of the virtual avatar motion to the person's real motion, where it either moves faster or slower relative to the real hand. The idea is that, these are ways in which we're essentially contaminating the interface. And what we're looking to see is whether or not there are these concurrent reductions in both agency and performance. And then we basically repeat that same protocol for a force-based task as well. So, let's see if this video will play. On the bottom screen, we're showing somebody progressively applying force to this, what we call a pinch apparatus that has these high fidelity load cells. And their objective is to try to track this growing ramp as best they can. Again, we vary the interface according to those dimensions I described earlier for both the motion protocol and force protocol in the same way. And basically for a very simple task, I think it's very interesting that, you don't need training to be able to do these tasks. You can kind of successfully do them and complete them in any number of ways, but just by having these subtle changes in the interface, you can get a significant difference in both performance and these measures for agency. And then in the aggregate, we seem to see this general positive correlation between performance and agency. Now, when we go to this next level of like having to personalize, there's still a lot of noise in this measurement, but there still seems to be this fundamental coupling between performance and agency, which is intuitive, but the literature to date hadn't really established that relationship explicitly for protocols that could be used for motor rehabilitation training. So overall, the inferences for rehab, agency and performance with computerized motor tasks seem to be sensitive to these relatively subtle changes in control of the interface. And it seems as if there is a positive agency performance correlation for both force and motion-driven tasks. And computerized interfaces such as virtual reality should consider customizing training to co-enhance agency and performance. At least that's the case we're trying to make. So now going to the second line of fundamental science research that we do, I described what augmented sensory feedback is. I'll give you examples as we move along. But basically, we wanted to see whether or not, again, for a relatively simple task, one in which training is not required, but if we do attempt to train with augmented sensory feedback and we vary the feedback along these dimensional features, would we see differences in performance or responses in general? And ultimately we do. So the features that we were looking at initially are intermittency, meaning how often is the feedback provided. There's literature to suggest that if we can reduce the reliance on feedback, that should be important for motor learning. We also are interested in looking at, depending on the modality that's being applied, does that affect potential motor learning, especially for participants who might have deficits, say at certain sensory levels. That might be a basis by which to say that they may benefit from receiving ASF using different ASF types. And then also we look at representation of the feedback, meaning is the feedback showing something a little bit more abstracted in terms of the movement that the person is making versus is it provided to them in some kind of entity that they can embody, like a virtual avatar. And then finally, we are very interested in looking at, what is the level or amount of feedback that's provided. If we provide too much information, is that something, well, if I couch it as too much, then that might lead to overloading and cognitive overloading and reductions in performance. But there may be ways in which we can contextualize more information that is in fact beneficial for motor learning and give some results towards that end. So my first PhD student, which isn't the person here, this is actually my second PhD student, but my first PhD student was a semi-professional hockey player. Actually, due to injuries, he couldn't pursue his hockey career any longer and ended up pivoting to doing a PhD. So, for us, we just wanted to look at this from a basic fundamental science perspective before developing a platform for people with either spinal cord injury or traumatic brain injury. So we were very open as to what would be our platform movement in which to be able to see the effects of augmented sensory feedback. And he's very much into working out and decided to test this using the two-legged case. Very simply, somebody is to squat and then come back up. And the trajectory that you're seeing that they need to follow is the angle of their thigh. In a lot of squatting literature, it's basically the angle of the knee or the angle of the thigh that you're trying to approach to being more level for quote unquote an ideal squat. So that's what we're having them track. And we want them to track that as well as they can in time. And we provide them cues during the quote unquote training to have them do it better post-training. So that's the idea, to demonstrate during training, if we change certain features, does that have a positive effect in how they're able to independently do the movement after training. So the ways in which we vary the feedback, so shown in the previous video, basically what we refer to as simple abstract form of feedback. So it's abstract because we're giving you a profile of the motion in which the person can't really embody as much. They just see this abstract kinematic trajectory that they need to follow. But then primarily they are trying to track for performance purposes their thigh angle to that trajectory. But we can also present this where they have some, what we refer to as greater representation to self. So in this case, we show them changes in position and orientation of the thigh segment explicitly. So there is some lack of embodiment, and there's some distortion in perspective because they're seeing the change in angle in the sagittal plane while they themselves are faced in front of the computer. But at least initially with a 2D task, this is the best we can do initially before we move into virtual reality paradigms and can immerse in 3D. So now our complex case, which is interesting, is we also provide them information about their torso and shank segments in time and suggest to them ideal trajectories, but they're told that it's the thigh angle that they really need to track for performance, and that's the middle trajectory that's being seen. So in this case, it's quote unquote abstract because we're presenting the motion simply as these sinusoid trajectories. And then we have the complex representative case where we're basically just showing them the stick figure in the sagittal plane where the torso, thigh, and shankman appear to be connected and are moving synergistically in time. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we're also looking at intermittency. There's previous literature consistent with a notion called the guidance hypothesis that if you can reduce the reliance on feedback, that is helpful for developing intrinsic mechanisms for motor learning. So we essentially showed results that were consistent with that, but what we're doing that's interesting or different is we're examining across these levels of representation as well. So have more to show. Don't want to spend too much time in terms of the data for any one slide, but I would say based on the accuracy of adhering to the target trajectory and also what we refer to as the consistency, meaning the standard deviation of error to the target trajectory, the overall winner would have been the complex representative case. So this would suggest that there may be some performance benefit of embodiment as done in VR. If there are questions, I'm happy to talk about this further, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to move this along. So general inferences for rehab for the fundamental science work that we did, varying these VF features for, again, these very simple movements that don't really require training to just basically accomplish. But if we do train and we are making these subtle changes in how we're presenting feedback during training, we in fact can get significant changes in post-training performance. Okay, and so one thing I should say, none of what I'm presenting here is really indicative of true motor learning. You do need paradigms that are more longitudinal, that have follow-up sessions. Everything we've been doing to date has been a one-off. That's what we've had time, effort, funding to be able to do. But we are moving this stage where now we're trying to look at, whether or not true motor learning can be achieved based on optimizing across these features. But there is literature to suggest that short-term retention is in fact indicative of long-term learning. And that's the basis of rationalizing in our publications to date why this is appropriate, at least at this initial stage. So now I'll describe the actual platforms for rehab that include virtual reality that we've tested both with neurotypicals initially, and then we've in the process of still doing and have completed a couple studies with clinical populations, including those with traumatic brain injury and also spinal cord injury. So the first platform referred to as the cognition glove. This is a VR-based system for learning functional grasp and place task. We've completed testing for our funded studies for people who have traumatic brain injury, who have, according to the MoCA scale, a moderate level brain injury. And then we've looked at individuals with incomplete cervical level spinal cord injury that have some impairment of upper body function. And then another platform called the sensory feedback brace, in which we're providing variations in augmented sensory feedback to train better muscle level control of muscles to then be used for reaching tasks. And we've examine that for both neurotypicals and then individuals who have spinal cord injury, again, incomplete cervical level. Okay, so the cognition glove, I'll spare details of like all the nuts and bolts of the parts, but basically they're on board these force and flex sensors that are activated when somebody is grasping an object. We have on board computation capabilities running a neural network that is inputting those force and flex sensors and is able to infer when somebody has secure grasp on an object. So basically what we're trying to do is inform the person as to when they have secure grasp as part of a training paradigm. And we're able to cue them either through audio cues or through visual cues that are on board the glove itself. So we're not using VR yet. I'll show you shortly whereafter where we use the same glove for a VR-based system. But our hypothesis is that during training, if we sort of bend their perception of time between their action of securely grasping an object and then the sensory consequence being when they're informed they have secure grasp, that we are able to modulate their perception of time, which is intended to modulate agency. We don't demonstrate that explicitly, but that's the inference that we're after, that we can still get a change in performance of the task. So the task itself is grabbing an object, a small object, and moving it from one location to another location, and trying to do so with minimal path length, and generally doing it in shorter time. But we let the participants know the important thing to try to minimize is path length while doing the task as naturally as you can. So initially, we're doing this all with neurotypical participants. So obviously, they don't need any training to do this. It's a really simple task. It's very straightforward. But if what we discover is if we prime them with training in a certain way, that we can, in fact, change their performance post-training. So what we saw for our 3 training cases, one in which we provide them no feedback of secure grasp versus when we provide them immediate feedback. So the audio cues and the visual cues are provided immediately upon achieving secure grasp. And then we have this case we call intentional binding feedback. So in this case, this is where we're trying to prime them. We basically have a delay from which they achieve secure grasp versus when they actually get informed, mainly through audio cues. That's what they respond to more when the cues are off of the glove, as to when they achieved secure grasp. So we initially start with the training, there being a 1-second delay, and then we slowly progress that delay down to 0 across 30 trials. So the idea there is to basically bend their perception of time that is noted to be associated with agency and seeing whether or not that leads to a change in performance. And in fact, it did. So again, for neurotypical participants, they were able to have an improvement in how they did this task in terms of both completion time and taking a shorter path length with this intentional binding feedback. So again, not clear if agency was actually imposed upon them, but to me, it's very interesting that, if we provide these sensory-driven cues differently based on timing and basically trying to massage their perception of action sensory consequence, we in fact can elicit better performance. So this is the version of the glove in which we now incorporate virtual reality. So this is what we refer to as mixed mode reality. So in this case, the person is touching a real object, but then they're perceiving or they're viewing the environment as a virtual reality environment. So as you can imagine, the challenge here is calibrating the position of the virtual object and the real object. So the reason to do this in virtual reality is to have more control in enhancing the sensory cues that are being provided and seeing whether or not or to what degree that has an impact, both on performance and then also on physiological responses, mainly EEG. So we had a funded study from the New Jersey Health Foundation to examine this VR platform with individuals who have traumatic brain injury. As I mentioned before, according to MoCA, or the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test, they were scored as having moderate injury. But as you can see, they function at a fairly high level. They may be a little bit slower in their movements from the neurotypical participants we had earlier, but otherwise they really reflect neurotypical characteristics. But the response in terms of performance and EEG, as I'll show you later, is unique from neurotypicals. So the neurotypicals served as our control group. We collected EEG, and then we examined ASF training under 2 conditions, one in which they only heard the beep versus when they heard the beep and then also saw the actual object change colors, specifically to green. Hopefully you had noted from the previous video. So in terms of EEG activity, so we were a little bit more interested in looking at alpha bands, but really we saw a group effect of increased EEG. As expected, the additional cueing increased EEG for both neurotypical and the TBI group. However, when it came to performance, the additional cueing was helpful for the TBI group. In fact, it was only with the additional cueing, meaning the inclusion of visual feedback, they had an improvement in performance post-training compared to before training. For neurotypicals, however, the additional cueing worsened performance, which to me suggests cognitive overloading. Usually cognitive overloading is a little bit of a challenging metric where it's not just a matter of an EEG threshold. You have to cross-validate with some other measure. And in our case, it was just our performance measure. So the worsening performance is indicative of cognitive overloading for the neurotypicals. However, with the TBI group, we see an increase in performance. And as I'll mention here, we think that maybe with the damaged brain network that there are these higher thresholds for learning, and the additional cueing was in fact necessary to cross those thresholds more consistently for the TBI group. I don't know that definitively, but that's our working hypothesis with the results that we're seeing. Okay, and ultimately for me, this is a case whereby, you know, depending on the neurological profile of the individual, how we provide cueing is important, suggesting the need to personalize these cues depending on the individual themselves. So we basically did the same protocol, slightly different training conditions for people who have spinal cord injury as part of another funded study. This was with the Department of VA. So we had 3 ASF training conditions.
Cool.
Basically, so what you're seeing here in the video is the VR training conditions, but we also had 2 non-VR conditions. So there is a rationale as to why we select the conditions that we did for either groups. They're not consistent, but a lot of it has to do with sort of our limitations of time with each of these participant groups and the comparisons we want to make for previous studies done with neurotypicals. I'll spare you some of that rationale unless you're interested, but the 3 cases that we looked at were no feedback, but they still wore the glove during training, receiving just audio feedback from the glove versus then getting audio and visual feedback from VR. So these aren't perfect comparisons. There's not a way in which we can see every layer of condition for a comprehensive set of comparison across conditions, but essentially we have, you know, the no feedback case being our ultimate control, but then we have a case for people who have spinal cord injury that involves less intense cueing with just the glove versus more intense cueing with virtual reality. And, you know, what we saw was interesting and a little bit consistent with what we saw with the people having TBI. So as expected, additional cueing, in fact, increased EEG post-training, but it was only the VR feedback that facilitated a significant difference or a significant improvement in performance post-training. So again, maybe like TBI, that in the presence of some type of neurological injury, there is in fact a higher threshold for sensory-based learning. So maybe glove-only feedback was simply insufficient to leverage learning. Even though they responded with increased EEG, it still didn't facilitate learning. And again, this is short-term learning. Like, I just want to be very clear about that. It's not true learning, but at least short-term learning in terms of short-term improvements in motor performance. Okay, so general inferences for rehab. I think systematic modulation of perception to train improved motor function may in fact be feasible. And then training with ASF may distinctly impact both neurological activity and performance depending on the levels of ASF enhancement, the neurological profile of the participant, again, which for me, the ultimate case is the need to further have to personalize these treatments for individuals along, you know, fairly nuanced dimensions, including how you're cueing them with sensory feedback. So this will be the last platform that I talk about. This is the multi-sensory brace for motor training. We had done some prior work in public disclosures with the studies we've done with neurotypical participants. We have done some work with SCI, but now we're really ramping up to develop an adaptive control system for this platform with the NSF Career Award funding that we recently received just last year. So basically, we have this position adjustable brace that allows the person to have gravity support at different positions. So this is really intended to facilitate, you know, more versatility in exercise for people who have spinal cord injury, such that they can exert muscle activations at different positions or at different muscle lengths without having to devote so much muscle activity to just lift their arm against gravity. But once in a particular position for exercising, they have this brace in which they push in different directions in order to exert muscle effort in controlling a virtual avatar, which I'll show on the next slide. So the EMG activity is measured through these wireless skin surface sensors and serve as inputs to a machine learning pattern classifier that then detects command intention of direction and speed in controlling some virtual entity. For us, it is a virtual robot arm that is moving around to contact targets, which again, I'll show you right here. So the task is to command a virtual robot arm to efficiently reach and contact targets. During training, we provide variations in cues, visual cues, haptic cues, which are vibration motors at the hand, And then also multimodal feedback where we provide both visual and haptic. We also have the control case of no feedback during training as well. Our performance measures are very similar to what we've used before, which is just path length of the end effector moving across the space and how quickly you're contacting all the targets in a given trial. And we're interested in looking at physiological responses related to EEG activity, EDA activity. We're also looking at ECG. And then we take a battery of surveys, not only agency, but also motivation and utility. So anyways, this is what the protocol looks like in action. So this is with a neurotypical. I'll show you a case in which somebody with spinal cord injury is using this platform. But the person is basically just exerting muscle effort in intended directions to be able to drive motion of this VR avatar. So in this case, there is no feedback being provided. These are the test trials in which we want to examine what is the effect of training. Okay, so during training, I won't belabor this point because this very much follows similar notions to that squat protocol that I had shown results for earlier, where we're varying, intensity and intermittency, and also type. So we're basically toggling between visual feedback, visual only augmented sensory feedback, haptic only augmented sensory feedback, and then multimodal. So anyways, just I think kind of running out of time. So just to keep moving. So basically for a task, which again, you don't really need training to be able to do, but this is definitely a little bit more exerting than the simple grasp and place task that I'd shown earlier with the cognition glove. It looks like in this case, what we refer to as mild continuous feedback, where the only feedback that you get is of a ghost avatar of just the end effector, as opposed to the entire arm, which we refer to as being more intense. And when it's provided more consistently or continuously, it seems to lead to the best performance in this case, to suggest that this really does depend on task as to which type of feedback may be more beneficial, in addition to like whatever is the specific capabilities of the participant. But what I think is also interesting is what has facilitated changes or greater increases in electrodermal activity. So going into this, there was a presumption that the more intense feedback might facilitate more electrodermal activity, suggestive of arousal. So EDA is essentially changes in small changes in perspiration at the skin. The person shouldn't be sweating profusely. So this should be a relatively subtle measure to indicate emotional affect or engagement or arousal at that level. So what we actually saw was the mild feedback actually produced greater increases in EDA, and then it was the mild continuous case that also facilitated better performance. So this suggested, at least to me, that the milder feedback is what is more attractive to the person to feel like they want to do the task, that the more complex or intense feedback actually became off-putting such that the person disengaged. It's not that they struggled with the additional feedback, but they in fact disengaged or were off-put by also having a representation of the arm. In terms of EEG, the profile followed pretty much what we expected, where generally more continuous feedback led to higher EEG, and then generally the more intense feedback led to greater EEG. So when looking across conditions, generally the visual augmented sensory feedback was the winner. But what I really want to turn your attention to is that there was some participant level preferences or inclinations towards haptic feedback or multimodal feedback. So if you take whatever was the best case ASF for each person relative to no ASF, there was a larger change that could be discerned. So what we saw is across the 15 participants, actually for 2 people, no augmented sensory feedback actually ended up being the winner, but 5 for visual, 4 for haptic, and then 4 for multimodal. So this really does suggest, like, again, the need for personalization, and how even though all of these participants are neurotypical, there are some preferences towards being cued visually versus haptically. So there are surveys out there. In fact, we implemented one to try to discriminate, what type of learner is the person? Are they more of a visual learner versus a haptic learner? And I'll share those results later. So in terms of EEG, we saw what we were expecting, where more intense feedback during training led to greater EEG output post-training. But the EDA was interesting. Again, it's like the performance and the increase in electrodermal activity, or the greatest increase in electrodermal activity, was in fact observed with visual augmented sensory feedback. So again, this does suggest that, EDA may be a good measure or predictor for performance. If you have a paradigm in which, again, you're not overstressing the person or causing them to sweat profusely, if you can get them to feel, quote unquote, more engaged through the sensory cueing, or whatever it may be, whatever is the design feature that you're looking at, that in fact will fundamentally lead to increased performance. So this is an actual real-time physiological measure, as opposed to maybe a perceptional measure that is done afterwards, where you ask the person to what degree did they feel engaged to the training paradigm. Okay, so just some perception surveys of note for this particular study. Agency didn't appear to be impacted. Haptic feedback alone or combined with visual feedback reported to be more motivating and more useful. However, that didn't necessarily correlate with improved performance. It was the visual cueing that overall was the winner. So we did do these perceptual learning surveys before the experiment, and it did appear that participants did have some bias towards certain ways of being cued that didn't actually end up being consistent with the type of cueing that they performed best with. So when I talk about how certain participants have preferential cueing, it might not be something that you tease out based on what they verbally express to you, that you actually do have to do the test and see what is the kind of cueing that they actually respond best to. So I'm close to wrapping up, I promise. So this is just an example of the brace protocol done with somebody who has spinal cord injury. So we do have results that we're still teasing out, but I just want to pretty much bring to your attention how they generally respond well to the protocol. So you might see some additional shakiness in their control of the robot arm. That actually is more attributed to an older version of the classifier. In the newer protocol, I'm sorry, I don't have an updated video. People with spinal cord injury very much control the robot arm very similarly to people who are neurotypical. The analysis is still ongoing, but we're seeing results trending in similar directions with the neurotypical. So that generally the visual only ASF seems to be the overall winner. So varying ASF features seems to be impactful on performance and physiological measures, and it can depend on the type of the ASF being used. We didn't explicitly look at difficulty, but at least comparing the brace to the glove protocol, there is greater exertion of effort, and that may explain why there were some differences in responses in the type of ASF being used for one platform versus the other. There may be some consideration of individual level preferences that are biased, that are not in the favor of the person and how they perform. And then certain physiological measures, specifically EDA in this case, may be predictive of performance. So I won't go into too much detail here, but basically the brace platform that we have, we are now developing an adaptive controller for it, where we're feeding back into the system not only how they're doing, but also how they're predicted to do according to these models that we've inferred for both an SCI population and a neurotypical population that is using psychophysiological measures as the inputs to predict the performance. And, we're expecting to see faster convergence to a level of difficulty and complexity that should be optimal to each person. So initially they're cataloged according to which population they belong to, neurotypical versus spinal cord injury, but then we iteratively personalize for each person as they're using the system. So last slide. The need and opportunity for personalizing sensory-driven interfaces for motor rehab training, to me, is very apparent. Performance perceptions and physiological measures are responsive to how the sensory cues are being delivered. And I think these responses depend on type of cues, the features of the cues, and then the neurological profile of the participant. And as I said at the very beginning of my talk, I think, taking an approach like this, we're still fundamentally focused on performance. But if we are, in fact, tapping into how the person is feeling as part of the training over a period of time, there may be some well-being benefits as well. So this is just a picture of my lab, or one of the years in my lab. I'm just highlighting the students that have served as an author on a paper, a co-author on some published paper. These are my funding sources that were described earlier. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We already have a question in the Q&A. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. If you wouldn't mind sharing your screen, stop sharing your screen just for now while we do the Q&A, and then I'll have you share the last slide again in a minute. But the one question in the chat is, are you still, or in the Q&A, are you still recruiting for the study? I was speaking with Ming Zhao and Dr. Harrell about a year ago in regards to the trial. And separately, is there any thought of using this type of training being used in conjunction with population coding in brain interfacing devices to improve function?
Yes, so to take the second question first, right now we're doing everything in our own version of a BCI where it's muscle control. Ultimately, the brain does control the muscles, but certainly we can take the measurements more upstream. I will say, I think our setup is relatively simple in terms of doing 2D directional control with muscles, and we still have fundamental challenges in terms of how much data we need to collect, like during the training session, in order to be able to run the experiment. So doing something at the BCI level would be that much more challenging. Doesn't mean that we can't do it. And obviously everybody knows, the potential benefits of being able to drive things, at the brain level in terms of the versatility of things you can do. So there's thoughts about doing that. Just right now we're kind of running into some of the practicalities of that. In terms of recruiting, so yeah, it's interesting you're talking. So Ming Zhao is my second PhD student. He was the one who was squatting, FYI. And that particular study we have completed at the VA. Dr. Harrell is still our prime collaborator also for the NSF Career Award, but for that study, yes, we are recruiting individuals with spinal cord injury. Right now, we're examining neurotypical responses to changes in difficulty, but the next step, hopefully end of summer, we'll bring in our first SCI participant into the lab at Stevens. So up to this point, we've been only doing testing at the Bronx VA Medical Center, specifically with the VA-funded grant that we have. But now with the NSF grant, we're able to also do studies at Stevens. So we are going to start recruiting soon.
All right, thank you. One of the panelists has a question, and because they're a panelist, they can't put it in the Q&A. So she asked me to ask it for her. How do you plan to address the personal learning preferences in future studies?
Yeah, so we're a little bit, disappointed to see that there seems to be this chasm between what people report as their preferences versus what they actually do better with. But there seems to be some consistency in what they do better with, in that it's a significant improvement over the no augmented sensory feedback case. So if we're supposed to use our results as the basis by which to design how we do this moving forward, then we need to do some type of protocol in which we at least initially tap into what their preference is, have them basically go through a series of test trials with the different types of feedback and see which they respond best to. I think, to do due diligence, we should ask them through perceptual surveys which ones they like better, but ultimately how they perform is going to be our guiding light as to what we intrinsically use with them initially as part of the adaptive protocols.
All right, thank you. And then there's one more question in the Q&A, probably the last one we have time for this afternoon, but what challenges do you see in translating these approaches to clinical practice?
Yeah, so as you can tell, they're a little technologically heavy. So I will say, at least compared to some of the counterpart systems I trained with at the Cleveland VA and at Case Western, what we do has a little bit less of an intensive footprint. I mean, as I suggested, we did a lot of these studies at the VA, so we had stuff that was in fact readily portable. But once you have it in place, there is challenges of setup and making sure the computers are communicating and that you do have a virtual reality system. But again, compared to some other technological systems, including like a powered exoskeleton or potentially a sensory motor prosthesis, which is not readily available for everyday clinical use, there's still a pathway in which to make this accessible clinically. The big challenge is what we talked about in, I think, question 1 regarding training the classifier. So that's challenged with that type of a system. But these basic concepts in terms of like cueing in virtual reality and trying to optimize how we cue, that can still be done with these fundamental motion protocols. So you can do it with marker-based motion capture or marker-less motion capture. So the system that we're using, the VR system with the glove, is marker-less motion capture. So that makes it easier as well, where you don't actually have to put markers on the person. You have some sort of program that has been trained to identify the body part of interest, which would be the hand or the arm. So if you can implement a markerless system, you're focused just on like how you're cueing them during training. I think this is very readily implementable in clinical settings. So it just depends on exactly what your goal is and what exactly you're trying to do. So for us, we're kind of broadly going across different spectrums of different levels of technological footprint to just identify features that we can implement as part of a platform, but then to now make the platform feasible for use, that's another set of considerations. But it's doable, right? Like that's why we're trying to just identify concepts that might be translatable. Then the next step is to identify a package that you can then use for a platform that clinicians can use readily and easily.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
And then there's one person in the chat who asked if they could get a link or contact information for you, if you could put that in the chat for them, if you would feel comfortable doing that. So your email or something, that would be great.
Sure. I think
And sorry,
I have it directly to Dan Kelly. I guess I should send it to everyone.
Yeah.
Sure. So email here, then the lab website.
Awesome. All right.
One way or another,
I feel like I'm
you'll find
asking
me.
you to do a lot of work considering you're our guest, but would you mind sharing that last slide again?
Sure, not a problem.
Thank you so much.
All minimal work. Oh, did not want to start at the first slide. Okay. All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So thank you, Dr. Nataraj, for a great presentation today and for joining our grand rounds. And thank you to everybody else for attending today's grand rounds. If there's any additional questions, Dr. Nataraj put his contact information in the chat, so please feel free to reach out directly to him. The recording for this webinar will be posted soon on the SCIMS website with a link to our YouTube channel. As a reminder, please see the chat for information on how to obtain CME credit for attending today's webinar. And at the end of the webinar, a brief 3-question survey will pop up. We would really appreciate your feedback because that helps us know which topics people are interested in and helps plan for our next grand rounds. We'll be taking July and August off just because so many people are off enjoying their summer vacations, and we will resume our grand rounds in September. So thank you all. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.